welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And in this episode, we welcome a very special guest, Bryan Gillette, who wrote a book called Epic Performance, in which he interviews 100 high-performing CEOs, CIOs, athletes, endurance athletes, and looks for commonalities, differences, and maybe tries to find the nugget of what drives that high performance. I thought it was an interesting book, getting that perspective from so many different people. So I wanted to have him on to find out what he learned. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Bryan Gillette. All right, so we're joined here by Bryan Gillette, and you wrote a book called Epic Performance, where you interview a lot of like high achievers, athletes, business people, that kind of stuff. And that's kind of what caught my attention. What made you write that book, a book like that?
Yeah, it's an experience to write a book. I do a lot around ultra distance events, and I think writing a book is similar to any ultra distance event. But Curtis, what really got me to write the book is I had talked to people, and I was getting ready to do something, whether it was run the 200 miles around Tahoe or travel around the world for a year with my kids. And I had several people come up to me and say, I could never do that. And in my heart, I thought, yeah, you probably could. Maybe you don't want to.
Yeah.
And so I knew what I had to do in order to do these ultra distance events, or former executive in human resources. But I wanted to understand I just kind of put this number in my head: 100 people. I wanted to talk to 100 people who were kind of at the top of their game, mostly in the business side. So a lot of CEOs, CIOs, kind of that CXO space. And then, so about 75% there. And then about 25 people in the ultra distance events. So somebody that's minimally done the equivalent of like an Ironman, and understand what are the behaviors that they do. How do they think really big? How do they really take their idea across the finish line in order to help somebody else do it?
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what kind of people did you talk to? Maybe not necessarily names, but maybe more specifically in certain areas. And were there any differences that you noticed maybe between the endurance athletes and the CIO, CEO, or were there a lot, more similarities?
Surprisingly, they were very similar. And it's not uncommon to see somebody at a CIO or a CEO who also has done some ultra distance, because it's that drive that gets them to think bigger, to push themselves, to stretch themselves in new ways. So, a lot, as I'd said, kind of 75% of the people were on the business side. And I wanted to understand, is there a similarity between business and sport? And my guess is you probably think that would think there is, because you interview a lot of sports folks. There is a similar mindset. So there were a lot of similarities. Now, in the book, it's called Epic Performance, and then lessons from 100 executives and endurance athletes on reaching your peak. But the epic performance, what that stands for, Curtis, is the E is, how do you envision the big things in life, at work, wherever that you want to accomplish. The P is, how do you put a plan in place in order to do that? So you got to be able to see it. You put your plan in place. Iterate is work toward it. You talk a lot about the Tour de France or NFL folks, and you don't start off riding your first bike in the Tour de France.
No, yeah.
You start off slower, and kind of the example I often use is, you don't start off running a marathon. You start off running 2 miles, and then 3 miles, and you work your way up. And that's what iterate is, the I in epic. The C is, how do you collaborate with others who've done this before? Pretty much everything that has been done before. And so how do you learn from the people that have been successful, and learn from the people that have not been successful? It's like, what do you want to do? What do you not want to do? And then lastly, it's the performance is, how do you go out and do it? So I found a lot of similarities, but generally, of those 5 behaviors, somebody isn't good at all 5.
Sure.
They're really good at 2 or 3, and they know what they're good at. And this is where I saw a lot of similarities. They know where they're good, and they're able to compensate for the areas that they're not as good.
So what kind of came out of that? Like, what is the essence of some of what makes someone a high achiever? If you sort of distill down some of those interviews and stories, is there something that ekes out? Is it that? Is it knowing where you're good at and kind of leaning into that, or is it,
You know,
the ability to chop up these large tasks? Or
yes. I mean, those were many of them. I think what a lot of them could really see big ideas, and they didn't know the word "I can't." I mean, at the end of the day, they would get this crazy ideas, and many of us it's like kind of say, "Oh, I can't," and maybe it is I can't today, but these people that I spoke with don't look at like I can't. Maybe they may say to themselves, "Well, I can't do it today, but I know I can eventually get there." And so they just don't understand I can't. Um, and it's that optimism that I know we can kind of drive toward it. And I talked to some folks that had these crazy big ideas for a company, and it didn't make it across the finish line, and so they had to pivot at some point.
oh
But
yeah.
it's that really, it's Curtis, it's that ability to, it's like, yeah, we can do this.
Oh yeah. Well, I thought it was interesting. You kind of opened up. You said, a lot of people say, "Oh, I can't," but it's really more maybe you choose not to. Like you can't right now, but there is a path that, you can chop it up into the smallest steps possible, and you can start, sort of one foot in front of the other to begin that journey, that
You
may end with a marathon or whatever.
You are so right. And when I'll, if I'm doing a keynote, there's one part where I talk about those phases of optimism from I can't to I did, and it's like I can't yet. And once you move from I can't to I can't yet, you're starting to see some level of optimism. And so that was that big thing, is that ability of like, okay, I can't, I maybe not be able to do it now, but I will be able to do it in the future.
Yeah, and sometimes that like huge workload that it actually does take to get from A to B is almost comforting, because the workload is also a path. If you're training for a marathon or something like that, and you've got to get up to X mileage per week, and then okay, well then how do I get up to X mileage per week? Okay, well then how do I do that without getting injured? Okay, how, and you sort of deconstruct it back down to like, well, I got to go do a short run right now to get started.
That's exactly it. And I remember, so I've been a cyclist for most of my life, and I've done a lot of endurance events. I cycled across the United States. I've done like a 300-mile in one day. And I remember kind of as I was finishing up that 300 miler, and it was like 2 or 3 in the morning. And I thought, what's next? Because I'm always asking that question, what's next? And I thought, I'm going to run a marathon. And I was not a runner. I always claimed I wasn't a runner. I didn't really run much at all. And I thought, I'm going to run a marathon. And I knew I could do it. I just had to get up and train. And I remember a couple weeks later, I'm working from home, and it's lunchtime. I thought, I'm gonna I'm gonna drive down to the local running store. I'm gonna buy some shoes, and I'm going to go for this 4-mile loop near our house. So I go get the shoes, come back. I do this 4-mile loop. I come back, everything's fine. And then, I'm on a couple phone calls, and it's in the afternoon. I got to go to the bathroom. So I walk upstairs, and as I go to walk upstairs, my legs are just like killing. And I thought, okay, this hurts. But it's like, okay, 4 miles hurts now, but in a week, 4 miles won't hurt. And then I'll be at
Sure.
5 miles and 6 miles and 7 miles. And Curtis, I want to go back to something you were talking about, is, we'll often say I can't, and it's that drive. And when I'm talking to groups, I'll ask them, what is one thing you want to do before you're 80? You know, that it's that one thing. It's like somebody says, "Oh, I want to be able to run a marathon," and in their head they come up with these excuses. I'm too old, I'm too fat, I'm too slow, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough time. And those are all excuses that we use, and sometimes they're more valid than others. And at the end, I asked them, it's like, do you want to? And if some people don't want to run a marathon, I get it. If you don't want to, go on and do something else. But if you want to, let's get rid of those other excuses and figure out, time and money. That's all about priorities. And so you gotta.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's how do you spend your time? How do you spend your money? The oldest guy that ran a marathon, I think he started in his late 80s, and he ran one when he was 100. It's like, all right,
Yeah. You
you're
got
not,
time.
you got
Yeah.
time. You're not too
Yeah.
old.
So what made you do these long endurance things? And, was it just the challenge of it, or was it something that you initially started to get in shape and then it devolved into that, or what was that journey like?
Yeah, I'm sure some psychiatrists could really dig into that question and give you a much better answer than I could. But I I started cycling when I was in my teens, and I enjoyed it. And I started cycling before then, but I started doing longer distance cycling in my teens, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. The first ride was I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I rode from San Francisco up to Yosemite. It was 200 miles. Did it over 4 days, and I enjoyed that thrill. It's like, I did this. Most people drive it, and I rode my bike. And so it just got bigger, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna come down from Canada into the San Francisco Bay Area. And then I thought, wouldn't it be cool to go, and a friend of mine had done this, across the United States. So it just kind of grew into something. And then you get older and you have kids, and it's harder to be gone for 2 months. It's doable, but it's harder. And so it's like, I'm going to do a lot of one day. And so you do the 100 milers, and then the 200 milers, and then a 300 mile it's just like, that sounds intriguing. And then, I did the same thing with running. It's like, I needed a different outlet. I needed something to challenge me, both physically and mentally. And I'm extremely goal oriented, and I'm just wired that way. And so it's like, okay, what's next? My
Yeah. And
poor
there's
wife
some,
has to deal with it, but
but there's something about that sort of like confronting the challenge, or, sort of like you're the aggressor in a sense, and it works. Whereas like, I think sometimes, if people almost get on the back foot and it becomes this big stressor. But if you're sort of going at something, you can do these amazing things like, build a business, ride a bike 300 miles, all that kind of stuff. Whereas if like the challenges are coming to you and you're almost sitting waiting for them, it can be this huge stressor. There's something about sort of launching into these challenges. Is that something you've seen with people? And
yeah, I hadn't looked at it that way, Curtis. I mean, I think these challenges make me stronger, and I can see it with other people. It made them stronger. Is when you purposely put yourself on into something like this, it does make you more resilient. And so when you are faced with challenges that you did not purposely put in front of you, I do believe, and I've seen that you are more resilient to handle those things, because you've put your body, your mind under that level of stress. And so I think there's some validity to what you're saying.
yeah. And the challenges that some of these people face that you interviewed, was there, um, I mean, they did face challenges. It wasn't all just sort of rosy. Were there any, stories that they shared with you, or, sort of ways that they overcame these stresses and challenges that they dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, there were folks that started up their business and invested a lot of money, and some that went on to be sold for a couple $1 billion, some that just went out of business. And then on the sports side, there were those instances where somebody was just pushing their body, and they've just pushed their mind and their body too far. So those did exist. And and each time, kind of that failure, or that inability to reach what their original goal was, some would look at it and say, oh yeah, I can't do that. What many of them looked at is like, okay, I just wasn't successful that time. What do I have to do differently? And so that ability to look at how do I look at things a little bit differently. It's I remember when I was training for Tahoe 200, which is a 200-mile run around Lake Tahoe, just this beautiful, iconic lake between California and Nevada. And one of the things I had to do from a training perspective was I had to run 30 miles a day for 4 days in a row. So you go out, you get up early in the morning, you do your 30 miles, you do the same thing the next day, and kind of the next 3 days. And I was out on my third day. It was August in California. It was hot. I was miserable. My legs hurt, and I was just whining to myself. And I've seen a bunch of people do this same thing, and I realized that, and it's like I'm 10 miles from home. I can be home in no time and not finish up the day. I'm only 10 miles into this run, and I realized, I have a friend of mine who's going through breast cancer. She's dealing with some real problems. Mine are self-induced, and mine I can stop any day, anytime, and be able to move forward and kind of be able to everything's going to be fine tomorrow. She couldn't stop. Mine were voluntary, hers weren't. So that ability to put things in perspective was one thing that I saw so many people do. Another one is the ability to understand, why are you doing this? What is your purpose for starting the business, for doing a 200-mile run, a marathon? And one of the guys that I spoke to, a successful engineer, CEO of this good size engineering company, and he was out training for an Ironman. So he had both the executive and the ultra distance side, and he was out training for an Ironman. And I said, "What kept you going?" And he goes, "I didn't want to die like my uncle did on the couch." And I said, "Tell me more." He said, "I saw my uncle hurt his back, and that put him on the couch, and it kind of left him there. He didn't get up, he didn't exercise, he got overweight. That made it even harder to exercise, and it was just this downward spiral. And I saw how he eventually died because of that. And I did not want that to happen to me. So when I know I have to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning to go for a swim or a run or a bike ride, I think of him. And it kind of solidifies that why of, this is why I'm doing this. And so that ability to really understand, why are you doing something, was just prevalent in so many of the people I talked to.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And that downward spiral or upward spiral, whichever way, is a real thing. It's that, grasping onto, can you, is there something you can do that, keep a promise to yourself, or do,
Right.
whatever, take a shower, something, and that's a positive. And that, then there's, the other sense of, if you sort of let all these little things constantly go, you sort of know it, yourself, hey, I didn't, whatever little thing, take out the trash on time or whatever. I didn't, and it compounds the other way. So it's like, if you can grasp onto some of these things, like, hey, I can go run, or I can go do this, or I can go do that, there's something there, that it's almost like keeping this little promise to yourself that keeps you going.
It is, and so often, and you use a marathon as example, you think of a marathon as 26.2 miles, and that is what its length is. But when you're standing at the start line, 26.2 miles may be the longest way. So don't think about it as 26.2 miles. Think about it as 5 miles to your first aid station. And then when you get to that aid station, you have 5 miles more, and you can run 5 miles. And so you just have to do that a couple of times. And so, Curtis, you're so right. It's like, break those things down into smaller chunks. I think sometimes it is good, and it's healthy, and it's helpful to be able to think about what that big picture is, kind of that, what's the mountaintop that I'm trying to reach? But sometimes that mountaintop is so far away it may be a year or 2 or 3 years away before you accomplish that, what are some of the smaller wins that, instead of getting to the mountaintop, I'm just going to get to that summit there. And once I get there, I'm going to reward myself because it's much easier to do that. And then you're not waiting for a year or 2 years for your next reward. Do it more quickly than that.
Oh yeah, you get the rewards along the way, and you have the ability to kind of even accomplish the task at all. If you start the marathon and you're thinking only about the 26.2 and you get, a mile and a half in and you don't feel great, then you start telling yourself, well, it's impossible. It's not
Right.
possible,
Yeah.
and it's sort of like, if it's more like, okay, I'm here now, one foot in front of the other, aid stations up ahead. Let me get there. Then I'll see how I feel then, and lo and behold, you'll get there. It's just,
Yeah. And at some point in a marathon, you are going to feel miserable. Almost everybody does at some point. Generally, it happens. People often joke that the halfway of a marathon is about the 21-mile marker. Somewhere in the 20 to 22, because the first 21 miles or so isn't too bad. It's that last 5 miles that is really hard. And once you can get, from 21 to 23, that's a big leap. And the ability to, okay, once you get to 23, it's like, okay, I just have a couple more miles. I can coast in. But you have to expect at some point along whatever journey you are on, you are going to hit a bottom. You are going to be miserable. You're going to be tired. You may, if you're running a company, you may be low on cash. And know that when that happens, how am I gonna move myself out of it?
oh yeah. So what's next? You've written the book, you do some keynotes. What, maybe a little bit about that. Do you have another book on the way? Do you have speeches coming up? Anything like that?
No, I don't have another book on the way. Maybe I've tried. I want to get through this one first and work on that one. I've got couple of speeches that I'm doing at some groups in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I do that. I facilitate a lot of executive retreats, so that keeps me busy. And I always like to have some goal that, kind of physical goal that I can focus on, that just to keep me in shape, because that's what keeps me, my wife is really good. She goes to the gym every single day, or not, I mean, she'll either swim or run or, do something kind of
Yeah,
workout. And she's really good at that. I work better. Whereas if I have that goal, that it drives me to do something every day.
I'm the same
So
way. Yeah.
so at the beginning of the year, or kind of the end of last year, I'm thinking, oh, God, I need a goal. I need a goal. What's something I can do? And I thought, I'm going to do one sit up for every year old I am every day. And so I'm mid 50s. So I'm going to do 54 sit ups, and I'll turn 55 in March. So I'll do 54 sit ups every day. And so January 1st. And so that's 20,001 sit ups this year. And if you think of 20,001, it's like, oh, that's daunting. But if you think of 54 every day, it's like, that's very doable. So, for January, I was doing 60 a day just because I like to have something in the bank in case there's a day where I can't do it. At least I've got something in the bank. And I thought, okay, 60 wasn't a problem. So now for the month of February, I've been doing 90 a day. It's like, okay, I'm going to continue to do 90, and I'll get, I don't know, 30,000 or so this year. But it's that drive.
Oh yeah.
That gets me. The other thing I'm thinking about, and my wife and I, and we have 2 boys, 2 teenage boys. We're going to go down to, just signed up to go down to Antarctica next Christmas. And they
Oh,
have
cool.
a running track on top of the boat. It's short because it's a relatively small boat. My son, who is high school, he does high school track and cross country. He said, "Dad, there's a running track on it." I said, "I know. I was thinking, because we're going to be on the ship and going to have nothing to do for a period of time. And if the weather's right and the boat's calm, maybe we should train and run a marathon on the ship and just do that lap. So this morning we were calculating how many laps, and we think it's somewhere around 300 laps. And so that's the one thing that's percolating in my head right now.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
He said, it's going to be the coolest Strava, because it's going to be a line going right down, toward the middle of the ocean.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it'll be a circle, but it'll be
well, you won't see the circle because you're going to be following the boat. Maybe,
yeah.
And it'll just be one line somewhere, in the middle of the Drake's Passage.
That's awesome. Well, where can people find the book or find you if they want to learn more about that?
Yeah, so the best way to connect up with me and learn more about the book's on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and type in Epic Performance, Bryan Gillette, or Epic Performance Lessons from 100 Executives and Endurance Athletes on Reaching Your Peak. You can also go to epicperformances.com. So that's EPIC performances with an S.com. And that allows you to connect up with me, kind of get more, get connected into the book and see those things.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. And you're welcome back anytime.
Hey, Curtis, it was great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.